I'll start with a few thank yous, and just to say that we will start with a screening of the documentary of the Tallinn Architecture Biennale, but we have with us tonight Matt McCallum of Miss TV Group, who made a documentary film that will be screened tonight. Getting this film last November was a wonderful, surprising gift, as I didn't expect anyone making a documentary about TAB 2019. I gave lots of interviews in a week. I was extremely exhausted after building up the exhibition at the Estonian Museum of Architecture in Tallinn. So thank you, Miss TV. Thank you, Matt, for being here. Thank you, Semir Zeki, for taking part in the mini symposium tonight. Semir is a neurobiologist, an expert at the neural correlates of the experience of beauty and also love and desire. He coined the term neuroesthetics and is a professor of neuroesthetics at UCL. Thank you, Tateo Nakajima, for being with us tonight. Tateo is a fellow at ARAP, an internationally recognized leader in the design of planning of cultural venues and developments, a big expert in building acoustics, and he's also a conductor who was trained as a violinist. Hanif Kara is sadly not with us tonight, as he takes part in a conference in South Africa, in Daba, and due to the coronavirus, many participants cancelled their participation over there. So the conference was rescheduled, and Hanif is still in Johannesburg, instead of back in London early this morning. Thank you, Catherine Forrester, for being the head partner of this event, continuing ABB support in me and in my subject. I'm very grateful to ABB sponsoring generously the catering this evening. Thank you. I wish at this mini symposium to focus at the neuroscience behind the experience of beauty, but also ask Hanif Kara and Tateo Nakajima, as people who work daily with architects and very familiar with their contribution, to reflect on their observations of our profession, its cultural bias against the old aspiration to beauty, since beauty matters anew, but the cultural bias are still deep. And I'll quote Hanif's statement a bit later. After the mini symposium, you'll be able to enjoy the food and drinks, as well as Paula Strunden installation over there, and they're behind you, and the Talking Trees of Tallinn, reinstalled first time after starring at the TAB 2019, and very much thanks to HTC Vive, who sponsored Paula's installation that captured the very experience of being in and surrounded by 6 out of the 8 projects exhibited at TAB. The reason it's here, this installation, is that experiencing a design project in a virtual reality installation is a wonderful tool to actually share from early sketches of projects the very experience of being in and around it, a wonderful tool to design along when aspiring to beauty, besides all the other virtues. In parallel, you'll see on these screens a slideshow about the Tallinn Architecture Biennale and the catalog and the AD magazine. More information and visual information will be there, both complementary of each other. The book's on sale, as you know, and the sale will take later place in the next room behind you. Thank you to the AA team supporting all these activities. Thank you, Ever French. Thank you, Manje, and the head of the AA public program. Thank you, Liam Green, the public programs coordinator, and thank you, Tom, from the audiovisual department. Thank you, the AA bookshop, for organizing the book sale. Thank you all for coming tonight. I see lots of friends, and am very grateful. A local gathering in days of worrying about the coronavirus. Hope you will enjoy the evening. So thank you very much. And just before screening the documentary, I will ask Matt to come here. I saw you earlier. Here you are. Thank you.
I'm not going to say too much, but thank you again, Yael, for organising this all. And My name's Matt. I'm from Mies TV. We're just a collection of students throughout Europe and the rest of the world who produce interviews, documentaries with architects and designers. We were lucky to exhibit at TAB, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the documentary. Thank you very much.
Why does beauty matter? That sort of question I was afraid of.
That's a big question.
Wow, that's a difficult question.
I'm very aware that most architects don't think that beauty matters. And so it's a very complex issue, and I just wanted to bring it in. I grew up in Tel Aviv, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s as a younger person, and Israel was still a very socialist country, and the look of things didn't matter. Beauty completely didn't matter. It was part of, the culture. But still, what matters is content, not form, not the look of things. There's an expression in Hebrew that says, and it's very common in Israel, don't look at the jar, the vase, but at the content. And the content was important. When I grew up, I said, no, I wanted to do architecture because I wanted to do things make the world more beautiful. And then when I started studying architecture, it was completely irrelevant.
Beauty matters because I think it's quite abstract quite often, which I kind of like. It's really hard to define, and it keeps you questioning what it is. I think it's a really big question, but it is something that when you find it, when you discover it, it gives you the greatest feeling that you can imagine. So I think it means a lot, and that's why so many people are inspired by it.
Wow, beauty is important for our life and for our future. Wow, the beauty and the usefulness could be well integrated, and I'm always trying to make such a beautiful integration.
Well, my profession is about beauty, so mathematicians know. Ask a mathematician why does he do mathematics, and he will answer you with 100% certainty because of beauty. I do mathematics because it's beautiful.
Beauty matters because beauty is the opposite of what I call the literal. The literal includes any form of knowledge, and the only actually two forms of knowledge that exist are either reducing a thing downward to its pieces or upward to its effects. But beauty isn't like that. Beauty has to do with what's intrinsic to a thing, and it's that which is in the thing that is not reducible in either direction.
Beauty matters because, from a neuroesthetic point of view, because it satisfies the brain. It satisfies in a number of ways.
Of course, it does matter, and it's this kind of, as the head curator Yael Reisner says, this kind of unspoken thing that outside of anyone or any of the creative disciplines, it gets thrown around a lot. You hear people say that things are beautiful every day, usually, but within the creative field, usually not. It matters because everyone else who's not creating or who's not designing or creating, whatever it might be, buildings or objects or films, or constantly refer to it as a real value for things in their environment. So obviously it does matter in that sense, yeah.
If you put effort into something, I think inherently there's a reward at the end, and within that there's a natural sense of care, and in that care comes love, and within love there's some beauty somehow.
Some people say, beauty matters now? That's so much heavier subject. But actually, they're all important. And I think that good architecture today, if it's not, I think sustainability without beauty is failing. It's not, you know, and I think everybody knows that, because if we tick all the boxes of, you know, building, you know, we tick all the sustainable requirements, if the building is ugly, we're not successful. So people know that. But, you know, if you look at awards and competition and juries and judgments, people don't even know how to talk about beauty. So it's not a category. It's a hidden category because we're still not choosing a terrible looking building that tick all the boxes. But it's so undiscussed and became so kind of irrelevant that we have to bring it back to be able to learn how to talk about it.
Opposite of beauty. Wow, that's a challenging question. Opposite to beauty is?
Politics. Okay, that's really ugly. I mean, that's pretending, it's making shows, lying. Politics is the opposite of beauty.
Yeah, because I like to see the world in a positive way. So even if it is not beautiful yet, well, we can make it beautiful.
The opposite of beauty is not the ugly, but the literal. The literal is the kind of understanding that thinks a thing is nothing more than the qualities it has. Whereas for me, both the beautiful and the ugly have to do with splitting the easy relationship between an object and its qualities. So they have a kind of tension between them.
The opposite of beauty. Well, I'm not sure it has one. The opposite of beauty is certainly not ugliness, even though we do find interesting correlations, but also very interesting differences in terms of brain activity during reports of beauty and during reports of ugliness.
I carry this subject with me for quite a while. There is a troubled relationship between architecture and beauty. So beauty became an empty word. It's sort of bourgeois, not progressive. You know, it has all the bad connotation. And I think it's still there because the cultural bias is so deep. At the end, I think every architect in his heart knows that beauty matters.
Architecture is a bit complicated thing, and you have to include lots of people into it. If you're designing a huge building, then there are tens and tens of people who are influencing the process. And if you make a piece of art, then you can do it almost alone. And no one is bothering you. And you make the choices. Not the ventilation guy, not the energy calculator, not the construction engineer, not the client. You don't have the client, you are the client. So that's why I like that personal approach in that matter.
Of course, beauty is very important, but beauty is not the only one priority of architecture design. For me, I feel beauty come out through the integration of the whole complexity of the world into one architecture in a very simple ideas, but creating such a diversity. And so in the process, starting point, I respect the whole complexity of the world, the complexity of the project and the situation, and listen to everything in a sense, and then try to find out how we can, integrate. Even though the whole situation is very nicely complex and diverse, finally we have to make one project. So this is kind of the process of the integration, but not simplifying the situations, like keeping the richness of the complexity and try to find the amazing viewpoint through which we can see the whole world really harmonized.
The use value of a building should be aestheticized. Immanuel Kant didn't think architecture was a very high form of art because it's contaminated in a certain sense with usefulness. But I think usefulness can also be aestheticized in its own right.
Generally, the idea is that artifactual category is dependent upon the biological category, and we might at first want to assign architecture to an artifactual category and keep it there. But if we look at how the brain responds to architecture and the way it responds to biological beauty, there are many more similarities than we might at first expect. And so unlike, say, furniture design or tool design, architecture fulfills a very interesting middle ground between the extremes of biology and sort of like machinery.
It is difficult to speak about beauty, to have a conversation about it, because we consider it a very subjective matter. More and more there is attempts to try to find what is it and to try to find a common ground from the field of neuroscience or the field of psychology. However, I mean, I don't think one needs to create a universal rule.
I'm going to say something quite terrible, but I really think it's true. For people to change their mind, or if we want people to believe in something we feel it's right, but it's fresh and new, it takes sometimes a whole generation to die, to have the next generation to take it for granted. And when a cultural bias is very deep, it takes more than a day or 2 months to change to change the feeling, the thoughts, the responses, because people act against the terrible beauty for so long that you don't just say, now it's fashionable to think this way. It's not. It's something much deeper. It's not a style or a trend or a trend, or it's something really deep in the way we think. It's really part of our culture.
This is not necessarily something that you search for. You not say, here you go, this is the project that we're presenting and it's beautiful, because it seems to be a status quo.
Yeah, when I was a student of university, in the summer holiday, I made the round trip of Europe. And the first place was Paris. I landed in the morning time. And then I took a train to come into the center of Paris, come out from the enter of the subway onto the street. And then I was really impressed by the beauty of the city of Paris in the morning sun. That was the moment I still really remember as a really strong reality. Yeah, life and the city itself and the weather, light, and yeah, the combination of everything created such an amazing beauty.
And I take at least 1 month every year completely off from the architecture and go to my favorite place, Tokyo, and stay there for 1 month and walk like 30 kilometers in a day with my camera around the huge chunk of city, the world's largest urban sprawl almost. And that's my vacation, and that's my method to find new things and new beauties.
What I was trying to achieve in terms of the exhibition is to, there was a task for the different exhibitors. So I selected the architects, and they got a task, right, which was to come up with habitation projects, right, because the plan was to look at beauty through the lens of habitation. I was very keen to wrap it all up with a certain atmosphere that enhanced the expression of aesthetics. The vision for habitation today or tomorrow is not anymore the image of metropolis, the 1930s, the kind of New York with the airplanes and all the different transportations and all very mechanical and all of that, the new technologies of the past, but actually a lot more nature. The intention was to enhance a certain atmosphere, which was very important for me, and then We got another thing which we were lucky to apply for a grant to have the VR experience, which is for a lot of us quite interesting. But it's not just the notion, oh, I see a headset, I'm happy to go into the 3D situation. It was really about understanding the projects better. So actually what you experience is to get into the project in a different way than just section plans, renders, 3D on the screen in the upper floor.
In fact, by definition, something being virtual means that it shares the attributes of something without being completely that other thing. Right? By definition, it's referencing something else. So if you have not experienced that something else, you're not fully understanding the virtual experience that you're having.
Yeah, so the project is called the Venn Room, and it speculates on what our domestic lives and our homes will turn into when AR, augmented reality, becomes something that normal people use every single day. We speculate on that the computer monitor and the smartphone will disappear in common use in the next 15 to 20 years and will be replaced by spatial computing, basically that all the computation platforms that we use, from social media to productive software, whatever, will be spatial, and therefore also all of our social activities that are digital.
Augmented reality was particularly appealing because it had a significantly lower barrier to entry, or we worked to create a lower barrier to entry than typically you have with robotics or machine learning, which have a very high technical overhead, and it's very difficult to both teach design and to teach the kind of fundamental knowledge that's required to pursue those topics. Whereas we find that with augmented reality, it's really engaging for people to work with their hands and to be crafting things in a slightly more traditional way while also engaging with the technology behind it.
The pavilion is produced by steam bending timber, and it's a little bit punk in its attitudes towards, say, detailing, which is just not at all important in that project. It's rough and raw. And it's super steampunk in its relationship to technology. You know, we're doing things by hand with old analog tools, but we're using this, like, let's call it like a magical headset which shows you all of the information that you need to construct something wildly complex. I guess we are trying to offer a vision for an alternative way to think about designing and making, though, which is much more democratic. So it opens up the accessibility of digital models to people who maybe aren't digitally literate, and that is I think that's a really important vision, because we're at risk of losing a whole lot of material expertise and knowledge and skills by automating everything or by doing everything through digital modeling.
And it's also very important to keep in mind that what we today call VR or AR is not a technology that came out of nothing. It is a natural progression of virtual media that has been developing since the very first ones. You could even include the non-digital or non-electric ones, such as sculpture and painting. But if we do include the early analog ones, such as photography, and then leading up to the motion picture, the television, and then the computer monitor, they're all the same project. And AR and VR is just the next step.
I guess we don't intentionally try to create work that we don't like. I mean, we like what we do, that's why we do it.
Yeah, I think functionality in itself is something that we probably focus on at an early start, just like how everything's going to work. And then through the explorations of the meaning and virtually everything that's going to be useful, the beauty somehow emerge.
Our work really looks at simplifying methods and taking craft, but using kind of digital models to find ways in which we can use repetition and use certain kind of technologies to encourage those crafts to make something totally new and unique.
And I think VR and updated technologies such as that may help concretize, help us make more sense of some of these more abstract thought experiments that maybe haven't had that much tooth in other disciplines outside of philosophy. It may help with discourse across disciplines, just to help make sense of those more abstract ways of thinking.
It's a personal project for me. So far, it's probably the most personal thing I have ever done in an art form, because it describes the environment which I was growing up, like in more than 10 years. I spent my childhood in a huge housing block of Lasnamäe, which is part of Tallinn, and for some reason it matters to me still.
So I'm here in Tallinn as part of the Tallinn Architecture Biennale to bring a project called Musicity, which is a project I've been developing for the past 8 years. And the idea is that we work with local musicians from Tallinn to each create a piece of music inspired by a different location and a different building. For a long time I was kind of curious about the idea of commissioning music based on architecture. So the idea that you could have a soundtrack to a building. But the secret is, you need a smartphone with our app, and you go to the location and then you can stream the music. So it basically gives you a sense of the building and the musical response to it.
One of the words that we love is ambiguity. And, so effectively, like our work sometimes been described as ugly. And it seems to be surprising for us because obviously we don't really perceive it this way. But with time we actually took it as a compliment.
Who said our work was ugly? Oh, right, yeah. Okay.
Just get that one.
I got further confidence to go about it through findings in neuroscience and talking to mathematicians and other disciplines that actually beauty matters to them. They never stop believing in beauty. The part of the idea of the symposium was one of the ideas there was to bring the neuroscientist, the philosopher, the mathematician, and the poetess to argue and discuss the subject, because they all of them who came in believe in the return of beauty, or in the beauty that never disappeared, or in the importance of it.
I was invited here because I believe strongly that beauty should be at the center of philosophy, and that goes very well with what Yael wanted the conference to be about.
And I am here representing Semir Zeki and the neuroesthetic point of view and some findings from the UCL Laboratory of Neurobiology.
Mathematics is not a science, it's art. Why is that? Because when things fall into place, that's what happens in mathematics. You're trying to find some order. And when things fall into place, that's beautiful. That's when something just right fits right into the like a puzzle. You find a piece of puzzle that fits just right, you feel it's beautiful. And that's what happens in my profession.
So, and I brought them to make the architects who are not confident about the subject, who still have much deeper cultural bias against it. I hope that these scholars will make them more confident, or just make them think about it. And a lot of people will say, beauty is a silly thing, it's a nice detail. And that's not beauty. Beauty is, and what we heard in the symposium by different people and different disciplines, beauty is much more profound, and beauty is much harder to get, to achieve, and so, say people refer, they hear beauty because it's so undiscussed, and they think of Renaissance, because Renaissance was talking about beauty, perfection, and ideal beauty and all that. It's not the beauty today. So, as I keep saying, beauty is not a singular idea. Beauty could be many different things. Not things, but different aesthetics. We all know that, we are aware of it. Aesthetics are changing, but we know very well when something is beautiful, when something is not beautiful.
Beauty is about truth, about fitting into the world. Beauty is about hidden order. There is some hidden order that you find. And this order is something that fits into the picture. In this case, in this sense, it is true. It's truth, about truth.
I think we shouldn't say we have like one beauty and everybody should go for that. This is kind of the misunderstanding, I think. We can find a lot of different beauty, and all of them has kind of amazing values on it.
In the natural world and in the diversity that keeps the natural world coexisting, it's the differences that create those moments of beauty. It is very much a subjective word, which is why I think it's been such an interesting conference, is everyone's got a very different opinion to what beauty might mean.
I think beauty is one aspect of aesthetics. So aesthetics is a larger philosophical discipline that interfaces with other disciplines such as neurobiology. It signifies the stabilization of perception in an otherwise unstable world.
It's a collision of different ideas, and to me, the best or the most impressive beauty is when you get disparate things clashing. So a mixing of different ideas and cultures, and that to me is creating the best beauties.
No one can define beauty, but we can categorize. We have a lot of characteristics. So as I keep saying, it's just like love. People understand that we cannot define love in 5 words, but there are lots of characteristics. So I think it's a big subject to come back to.
So it was Mark Cousins who was asking me in the late 1990s, you talk about what you like, but is there anything you really hate as an architect? And my reply was, 20th century focus on architecture, on the practical, utilitarian, and socio-economical, political issues, treating aesthetics as if it's not part of the architecture challenge. Content was satisfying and more significant, along a lack of respect of visual culture. So you saw this already in the film, so I'll skip it. That question led me to my PhD and to this book published in 2010, asserting my observations of the architectural discourse. The paradox is that good architecture and brilliant buildings are still mostly judged by the capacity to produce an attractive aesthetic experience. Architects became inexperienced in talking about beauty, as they haven't been consciously engaged with it for quite a while. For thousands of years, art was about aspiration to beauty. So what were the triggers through the 20th century for such a deep cultural bias that unify architects against aspiration to beauty? What is that turned that word empty? Nevertheless, sorry, I think it jumped here. Architecture's aspiration to beauty was leading the visual arts up to the 1920s. Early modernism generated a significant new aesthetic. Nevertheless, by the early 1940s, explained in the 60s by Rainer Bernham, the British architectural historian, aesthetic tendencies were eliminated, and the modernist scene became mostly about form follow function. And the apologists, the 3 historians, were Gideon, Mumford, and Sartoris. Architecture became strongly conditioned by utility, materials, construction, and economics. Aesthetics and subjectivity were 2 terms first time interrelated with the same document written by Baumgarten, who coined in the 18th century the word aesthetics to mean taste or sense of beauty, thereby inventing its modern usage that tied aesthetics with a personal attitude. Thus, rejection of one reduces the other. As was reflected through the writings by historians of architecture who shared a critique and an anti-subjectivist approach, undermining the influence of individuals on our culture, and we can see it in all of their writings and books. The objective-subjective conflict was enhanced by different phenomena leading to the intellectualization of a design process. 500 years of scientific progress and the appearance of numerous new technologies enhanced further trust in rational thinking. Increased use of abstract visualization of informational data in diagrams and graphs. For the 20th century democracy, public opinion took over individual taste and power. Mies van der Rohe's influential statement, objective limits and no subjective license. Or critique on the hegemony of the eye, often undermining the importance of aesthetic judgment in visual thinking in architecture. The human sense of vision has become the most slandered of our senses since the Second World War, and the cultural bias went deeper. Marcel Duchamp chosen everyday objects paved the way for conceptual art, work that was in the service of the mind, as opposed to a purely retinal art intended only to please the eye. Duchamp associated the eye with passivity. The Eyes of the Skins by Pelasma, the book by Pelasma, where he acted as a critique of Western ocular-centric tradition. The titles in the books captured well his approach. For example, the narcissist and nihilistic eye, retinal architecture, and the loss of plasticity. That critique of the hegemony of the eye or the retinal art were based on the wrong old information out there for hundreds of years, as if visual image is just impressed on the retina like on a camera's film. Yet our sense of vision is dynamic and not passive. Our seeing mechanism was understood only since 1978. For the question that no one had an answer for hundreds of years, what is that? What is it that all beautiful works have in common? Zeki's findings suggested the answer. He discovered in 2011 that there is a single set of characteristics defining beauty, and it actually comes from the brain. The only thing that all beautiful works of art have in common is the common denominator of the many different experiences of beauty, and it resides in our brain and not in the work of art or in nature, as was regarded before. We know immediately when we experience beauty, and the intensity of that emotional experience can be quantified too. Zeki's findings by 2014 made me wish to meet him and discuss beauty. His findings through fMRI tests reflected on the activation correlating with the experience of 4 types of beauty, which all take place in the same area of the emotional brain: visual beauty, musical beauty, moral beauty, and mathematical beauty. We have been meeting regularly since summer 2014, discussing the visual brain and the experience of beauty in the context of neuroscience and architecture. In the evolutionary context, there is a tremendous significance to the recurrence of pleasures, including the pleasure of experiencing beauty, for the very survival of the individual. Beauty is a critical determinant in the progress of civilization, said Zeki. Through days of climate crisis, certain questions are often raised. How could you indulge with pressing on the return to beauty in the midst of Anthropocene, in the state of ecological emergency? Of course we have to. Not an escapism or indulgence, a typical response based on cultural bias, but a need. Our brain thrives on beauty. Without it, life is a misery. We cannot simply define beauty as the experts in neuroscience and mathematics reassure us. The very two disciplines that contribute most to the science of beauty these days and to our understanding of how relevant beauty is to human life, health, and knowledge. The human's need to see is not for survival, but for gathering knowledge about the world we live in. Humans are visual creatures. 1/4 of their brain is a visual brain, our brain. We see color, we see human expression. Miller, the historian and philosopher of science, confirmed through his study, intuition was revealed to be synonymous with visualization. Albert Einstein claimed he visualized ideas before he could express them in writing. Oliver Sacks wrote in his autobiography, doctors almost lost their visual intuitive diagnosis skills. His professor, on the other hand, was intuitive in the extreme. He observed and understood the diagnosis before doing a neurological exam and even before the patient opened his mouth, just by observation. Now doctors look at factual reports, such as X-ray, MRI, still visual, and lost their reliance on observing appearances. Kurosawa, the Japanese film director, drew our attention to that loss. Zala is a film that reflects on the loss of our visual skills to understand nature visually, a survival tool lost, a whole body of knowledge lost. In architecture, the experience of beauty is there and diverse. Since we can suppress an aspiration to beauty culturally, but not neurobiologically. We cannot turn off our visual thinking since when we design as architects, we constantly sift and tweak to arrive at beauty, surely depending on our design intelligence and talent. Yet, since most architects don't aspire to beauty or discuss its added value, cityscapes became more and more alienating. And this was Hanif Kara.
We hope that with time, what can emerge out of this cacophony in a united fashion is a mutual desire to escape ugliness at many levels and an embracing of differences to deduce a productive relationship of greater creativity and utility rather than obviousness.
Ancient theory of relativity was quickly and widely accepted in 1915, not least thanks to the sheer beauty of its mathematical expression. Robert Diagraph claims that there is more scientific evidence than ever before that mathematical beauty plays an important role there. The characteristics of the experience of beauty, as mathematicians suggest, are surprise, magical effect, novelty, profundity, economy, clarity, elegance, expresses unconscious perception of order. Everything falls into place, give a sense of pleasure and satisfaction. We can characterize the experience of beauty, yet we cannot define it in simple terms. The mathematician Rona Aroni explained in his book, poets and mathematicians share a desire for beauty. In both disciplines, the secret of generating beauty is that the message is not completely understood. A sense of beauty is born in the unconscious grasp of notion. We experience beauty when we receive a strong message, whether emotional or intellectual, while comprehending it only subliminally. Isn't it fascinating that beauty in mathematical equations is a sign of an underlying logic? Order by itself is not necessarily beautiful. In order to create sensation of beauty, we need something beyond order. The sensation of beauty, by this approach, arises when order is suddenly revealed in disorder. While the term beauty remained taboo, poetics in architecture was repeatedly embraced. Was the pursuit of poetics in architecture a substitute to the tabooed word beauty? A backroad to beauty without mentioning the denigrated word? Gaston Bachelard's Poetic of Space arrived to fill the void of the 60s in architectural discourse. And I like the quote, "The poet does not confer the past of his image upon me, and yet his image immediately takes root in me." It was for a friend, Poetic Architecture, where he talks about the sense of place achieved through being engaged in a dynamic dialogue between the room outside and the room inside through the year. And as in Brussels, Norwegian Pavilion, below, the object shadows moved around the room as the sun moved outside. So Christian Norbert Schulz published the Genius Loci, very much influenced by conversation with Sverre Fehn and philosophy. Juhani Palasma wrote an influential, important text on the poeticized imagery, the pursuit of poetics in architecture, yet in time he kept questioning the architect's deliberate visual intention in leading to poetic architecture, claiming that artistic meaning is existential rather than ideational. I cannot agree more that poetic is emotional rather than intellectual, but question dismissing the ideational. Leon van Schaik discusses how poetics might define as the accumulated experience of place and space, advocating through examples of ideas-driven smaller practices, a trust in the architect's intimate landscape, mentalscape, skills, talent, and all that form the platform for poetic design. Marian Coletti, and I quote here from his article at the AD magazine, "To us, you are beauty, not important because you are attractive, but you are attractive because you are important. Your ambiguity challenges and defies default, neutral, unbiased design decisions that do nothing to progress, improve, and empower architecture in today's world. Beauty as a cultural production is not random, it is autobiographical. Architecture, beauty, is directly, even if subconsciously, informed and dependent on his, hers, culture, and whole internal landscape." Author or unemployed, Paul Virilio used to tell his students. An updated version should read, co-author or an unemployable. There is no incompatibility between authorship and teamwork in that we do now. Gerd Gigerenzer claims that human intuition is much richer than logic. In fact, the cerebral cortex, in which the flame of consciousness resides in, is packed with unconscious processes. It would be erroneous to assume that intelligence is necessarily conscious and deliberate. He argues that intuition is more than impulse and caprice. It has its own rationale. It is aesthetics in architecture and its pursuit through the design process that fuses utility, function, rationality, technology, economy, and poetics, image, metaphysics, art, and symbolization. Craftsmanship, authorship, ownership, a fast-moving truck. About 2010-11, architects' craftsmanship was clearly coming through manufacturing, reflecting on a meaningful change, as the very architectural drawing is their craft. Culturally, though, inconsistently with a prevalent anti-subjectivist claim. But the return to the author was there. Authorship in architecture, as in music, turned quickly to ownership, especially when files are easily shared and content is added or deleted. The upshot is a complex reality, while the open source design makes it even more so. Nevertheless, individuals often expect to be credited for their contribution. Around 2017, artificial intelligence researchers spelled out the significance of adding human intuition to AI. Generative design tools act through pure logic and lack intuition. Robots are good at precision and repetition. Humans are good at perception, awareness, and decision-making. Hence, AI researchers developing hybrids that augment robots with humans, augmenting digital gains with human intuition. Architects do too these days, but most still find it difficult to share their biased terminology and anti-subjectivist psychology. Beauty in augmented age or post-digital age are all relying on human judgment. Hence, it is no surprise that beauty matters anew. The use of post is somewhat misleading, as digital artists' interest as designers has evolved rather than abandoning digital exploration. The term post-digital was first heard around the year 2000 in relation to music, as the novelty of computer-generated work faded. By 2016, the post-digital became a category in architecture. As the post-digital has evolved architecturally, it brought a wider community of architects under this umbrella. The digital practices along those who mostly use digital systems to process rather than generate design. The post-digital, though diverse stylistically, signals a departure from formal continuity and a move towards an assembly of parts. So personal expression, ever since German Expressionism, was interpreted as irrational imposition. A continuous stream of architects are interested in pushing the boundaries architecturally, similarly to Hans Pelzig. We'll also suggest the only thing we have is our individuality. That's what we have to give to the world. Architecture is the most public of arts, he said. The young American Ukraine-born poet Ilya Kaminsky claimed in an interview this year, "Every real poet is a private poet, but if they are a good poet, their language will powerful enough to speak privately to many people at the same time. Architecture also has the power to speak to individuals, nurturing and preserving their differences and acknowledge their similarities, while giving identity to collectivist cultures." Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much. First of all, can you all hear me? Yeah. Very clearly? Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Now, I want to begin by thanking Yael for organizing this meeting and for accompanying me on a serious discussion of beauty over the past 3 years. I think she deserves the credit for pushing beauty into, or the concept of beauty into architectural thinking in a big way. Merci. And I hope that this meeting and all her work will bear fruit in the coming few years, if it hasn't borne already, which I think it has. Now, you will notice that the respondents in the film had considerable difficulty in understanding why beauty matters. And it's interesting that the title of this seminar is not why beauty matters in architecture or why architectural beauty matters, but why beauty matters. And it's significant phraseology because it implies that beauty in general from all sources matter. The difficulty that people have had tonight in defining beauty is in fact shared by most others, so it's a universal thing, but I think that we can define beauty in a rather simple way if we go back to the evolutionary and psychological roots and listen to what Sigmund Freud had to say about one thing, which is pleasure. So Sigmund Freud started by asking a very simple question, which he answered in a very nice way. He said, "What do people seek in life?" And his answer was happiness. And then added, this is from Civilization and its Discontent, "What decides the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the start. There can be no doubt about its efficacy." Now, the pleasure principle, of course, for Freud, being Freud, was largely sex. But in fact, it included other things like eating and drinking and being in a nice landscape. So one had to satisfy the pleasure principle. And pleasure, the title of his book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in German is Lustprinzip. Lust in German has got a double meaning of desire and also pleasure, and the significance of that will become apparent in a moment. Now, this is a very, very fundamental starting point for understanding why beauty matters, because the pleasure that we experience always correlates with activity in a given part of the brain, which is in the orbitofrontal cortex. There, right, this area here. So whether you win something, or you like chocolate or good food or whatever it is, whenever you have pleasure, there is activity in this part of the brain. So you can really, in a way, localize the pleasure principle to a given part of the brain, which does not, of course, act in isolation, which has lots of input from other parts, but is always critically active whenever people experience pleasure. Now, I want to tell you about the experiments which I'm going to briefly describe. I have to be extremely brief in describing these experiments. It's simply that you get people to look at things which they find beautiful, and you look at the activity in their brain when they experience beauty. Each person, of course, experiences a different kind of beauty, or so you think. And then you look at the brain, and what happens to the brain, very simply, is that cells in any area which is cells which are especially active, their metabolic requirement increases, so that more blood is drawn to that part of the brain, and the cameras around the head in magnetic resonance imaging can detect the difference between oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, because they've got different magnetic properties, and hence assign activity to a particular part of the brain, and also give you the intensity of the activity in that part of the brain. So if you ask people to look at visual stimuli or listen to musical excerpts, you find that different parts of the brain become active. With vision, you have the posterior part of the brain shown there in white, and with music you have the temporal cortex, the superior temporal cortex, which is active, the auditory cortex shown in green. But if you ask what are the parts of the brain which are active when people experience visual beauty or musical beauty, you find that with visual beauty it is again the medial orbital frontal cortex, the very region that is implicated in pleasure. And there are many antecedent experiments I could describe, but I'm not going to. I hope you take my word for it, that this area is critical for during the experience of pleasure. It's also critical for the experience of beauty, and of course, beauty cannot be separated from pleasure. Pleasure can be separated from beauty, but beauty cannot be separated from pleasure any more than reward can be separated from beauty. So if you ask what are the parts of the brain which are active when people experience musical beauty, by listening to musical excerpts, again you find the same area of the brain. So this is a conjunction which shows you that there's a given part of the brain which is active when you experience visual beauty or musical beauty. Which brings us to the question that it's not neurobiologists who asked, but it's an art historian, Clive Bell, who asked. He said, if you can tell me what is common to all that we experience as beauty, then you have essentially solved the problem of aesthetics. And I believe that we have, only in neurobiological terms, solved the problem of aesthetics or neuroesthetics, which is what is common to all that we experience as beautiful, what is common in terms of brain activity, and it is a given part of the brain, the medial orbital frontal cortex, which also happens to be the pleasure center of the brain. Now, I'm not going to go through all the other types of beauty, but this area is active with other types of beauty too, including moral beauty. Now, the second question. Since the time of Fechner and others dominating studies of aesthetics, can aesthetic judgment ever be quantified? And the answer is yes, they can, because if you look at the medial orbital frontal cortex, you find that it is more active when people declare something to be more beautiful. In other words, the activity level is more intense when you experience something as more beautiful than when you experience something as less beautiful. And so we have now answered two questions. Now, let me just summarize three questions. First, why beauty matters? Beauty matters because it respects the seeking of pleasure, the pleasure principle that Freud emphasized. By the way, Freud emphasized it after Fechner, Theodor Fechner, the founder of empirical aesthetics, and after Jeremy Bentham, the founder of my college, whose motto was Maximus Felicitas, the maximum happiness for the maximum number of people. So that's one answer, is beauty matters because it satisfies the pleasure principle in neural terms. Two, it is we can answer the question of why, the title here is why beauty matters, not why architectural beauty matters. What is common to all things our experience is beautiful? Well, all all things that are experienced beautiful have as a correlate activity in a specific part of the brain, which is quantifiable with respect to the declared intensity of the experience. Now, and the third one is, of course, the last point, that it is quantifiable, so it's scientifically accessible. Now, Lustprinzip of Sigmund Freud. Lust, as I said, is a German word which can be translated to mean, which has a sort of double meaning. It doesn't have it in English. Desire and pleasure. Lust, desire, pleasure. So let us see what happens when we desire something. It's an integral part of the definition of the pleasure principle of Sigmund Freud. And if you do an experiment, and these are all Japanese because I did the experiment in Japan with Japanese colleagues, so you ask people what they desire in terms of objects or people or events, you find again that the activity occurs in the medial orbitofrontal cortex, okay? And that this activity there, whether it's with events or with persons or with objects, so you're asking people to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 the people they find very desirable or the events they find very desirable, and you find there's activity in the medial orbitofrontal cortex with the experience of desire, and that activity also is quantifiable. So the more desirable an object or an event or a person is, the more intense the activity in the medial orbitofrontal cortex. So we are now coming nearer to saying that, look, what we are, the pleasure principle of Sigmund Freud, Lustprinzip, can be used to define why beauty matters. Not what beauty is, but why beauty matters, because it satisfies something a very large part of the brain, which is the part of the brain that is satisfied, that correlates with the experience of pleasure and of reward. Now, I can't think of a more precise definition of why beauty matters that's available today. It is extremely important to realize that this same part of the brain is active when you experience beauty derived from a highly cognitive source, namely beauty in mathematics. So again, what you do, you ask mathematicians, this time it has to be mathematicians, because you cannot take people in the streets at night and say, do you find a mathematical formula beautiful? They would not be able to answer that. But if you ask mathematicians to rate mathematical formulae, they can rate them for you in the scanner, and you then find that there are some mathematical formulas which are so beautiful that they come out in tears. And they describe to you the emotional reaction they've had with goose pimples and this and that, and all sorts of things. And the equation which all mathematicians have found most beautiful is the equation of Euler's identity equation, which my colleague in this study, Michael Atiyah, late Michael Atiyah, who died last year, described as the mathematical equivalent of Shakespeare's soliloquy in Hamlet. All right. Now, again, where does beauty derive from such a highly cognitive source as opposed to a sensory source? Where does it lead to, in the brain, does it lead to activity? And it is, again, our friend, the medial orbitofrontal cortex. And once again, the activity there is proportional, it's parametrically related to the declared intensity of the experience of beauty. Now, I emphasize mathematics because mathematics has been used by architects and by sculptors. Perhaps the greatest of them all was the mighty Michelangelo, who was both a great architect and a great mathematician. But we go before to Polykleitos in Greece. Polykleitos thought that he could design the perfect human body, and this is the reference of Polykleitos, the perfect human body by measurement. It was to take the diagonal of the thumb, treat it as a rectangle, take the diagonal, take the square root of that, and then multiply it again, 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 and this was the product. it is not the golden triangle, it's not symmetry, it's something else, and that is the difficulty in defining beauty. But nevertheless, the application of mathematical principles did produce bodies which were, in fact, quite remarkable. Of course, this is the Westmacott athlete, which is currently, unfortunately, in the vaults of the British Museum, is a remarkable piece of work, again, all done by mathematical means. What these mathematical means are, nobody really knows, but they have been employed by others since that time, including Vitruvius. Vitruvius, after all, was inspired by Polyclitus and Greek sculpture to come with the Vitruvian principles, which then Leonardo used the Vitruvian principles to translate into the perfect human form. This is the Vitruvian Man of Leonardo, which is the Academia in Venice. Not a very beautiful human body, but it is something. By the way, others have tried to do this, like Dürer, not nearly as well. But this is based on mathematical principles. Now, mathematical principles, what are they? Nobody really knows what these mathematical principles are, but I think we have to go back to, again, the great Michelangelo, what he said. He said, look, unlike Leonardo and Alberti and Vitruvius and all these people, I don't need measuring instruments because the measuring instruments are in my eye. And so he dispensed and emphasized idealism, just as others, such as Botticelli, for example, the three graces of Botticelli are really idealistic drawing. They're beautiful, they're idealistic drawing. But if you look at the three graces of Rubens at the National Gallery or in the Prado, you'll find that great a painter though Rubens was, he was an imitative painter. It was not an idealistic painting, and the results are not nearly as satisfactory as the three graces in the Primavera of Botticelli. Now, the greatest of them all, whose measuring instrument was in his eye, was, of course, Michelangelo. And this creation of Adam is surely one of the most idealistic depictions of the human body that there has been in Western art. Michelangelo himself said, I don't know. I don't know what mathematical principles I employ when I create this. But whether I'm doing a human body or whether I'm doing architecture, I depend on it. La dependenza, dependence. I hope I'm translating the word correctly. I depend upon those mathematical principles, although I don't know what they are. And it is quite interesting. It's quite interesting that you have to satisfy certain mathematical principles to find the beauty in a mathematical formulation, and then you get activity in medial-orbitofrontal cortex, just as the painting of Leonardo, of Michelangelo, they hated each other, has given pleasure to so many people. Now, architecture. I am totally innocent in the field of architecture, but I know what buildings are like. And let us remember that Michelangelo did say, I depend upon mathematical principles to create beautiful buildings. I don't know what they are, but I know that I depend on them. And he and Bernini, of course, were the creators of the Piazza, of St. Peter's Basilica and the Piazza. Now look at this. You see, the open arms into the Basilica of St. Peter, welcoming the weary pilgrim who comes from afar to find solace when he raises his heart and mind to his creator as he sees it, or her creator. But it is not only the entire concept, which is mathematically based, but also the details. So if you go through the detail in the colonnade, if you look at the columns, see, they're all very, very beautifully constructed. This is more idealistic than the sort of building that which was constructed by the Pantheon in Rome, which I rather like, and I especially chose this picture because this makes it look more joyful than it actually is. It's a somber building when seen in a cloudy day. But the details inside are also exhilarating, and it is not surprising that Michelangelo said of the Pantheon that he does not believe it was constructed by humans, but it was constructed by something extra human, some godlike. Now contrast that. So here is a building in which people have used mathematical principles which they know nothing about in terms of detail. If you were to ask them, what are these mathematical principles? They know nothing about it. All that can be said now is that mathematical beauty correlates with activity in the same part of the brain that which is active when you experience musical or visual or moral beauty, or beauty in harmony of colors, and also the same part of the brain which is active when you experience pleasure and reward. And so if you they constructed these things because up to a point they sort of felt this is beautiful and others will find it beautiful, and indeed they were right in terms of history. Compare that with another building which should welcome the weary cancer patient, anxious to find some help inside. This is in the Salpêtrière in Paris. This is it, all right? You can see that this is not a building which you approach with pleasure. At least I don't think I would. So you can see that the application of these mathematical principles, which are also principles of beauty, is of great interest in architecture, as it is in the construction of the human body. Now, I'm running out of time, but I want to say one thing, that people assume that, so a quick way, if in a dinner party or at a meeting you want to stifle discussion about beauty, you simply say, oh, but that's all subjective. The gustibus non est disputandum. On taste, there is no discussion because all subjective. Is that really true? No. So if you look at, for example, who in this audience, who here finds this woman ugly? Is there anyone who would describe this woman as ugly? Raise your hand. What?
The photograph's ugly.
I asked about the woman. That's another issue. and who would find this woman ugly? Now, I would like to have a comment on this. If somebody, does anyone have a comment on this? The hand. Thank you so much. So you see, it's biological beauty quick to pick up the fault there. There is certainly something disproportionate about fault, but the woman is beautiful, and not to appear too gender biased. Here is a Japanese actor. Now the same. I think if you were, so subjectivity really is not a good term to use to dismiss discussions on beauty, because subjectivity is not there for biological beauty. I mean, I've shown you 3 examples, and I can show you the examples of human bodies, and where you would agree that this is beautiful. So subjectivity, we decided not by dismissing it, but by a third person who then asks many people, how beautiful do you rate this to be on a scale of 1 to 10? And if he finds that 90% of people find it beautiful, then he has to conclude that it is highly objective. And this is what would happen with things like that. Now, it's no good people saying to me, but some people find this ugly. Well, of course, there are 7.5 billion of us, and there's a bell curve, and some people will fall there. After all, some people find deformed people very attractive. It happens. But there is no doubt that very, very beautiful people in one culture, biologically beautiful people in one culture, would also be considered biologically beautiful in others. This is not quite so true of architecture, because it does depend upon culture and learning to a greater extent. So the mosque here in Istanbul, I think, is very beautiful, but perhaps other people prefer temples or churches. The Sagrada Familia in Barcelona has come for much criticism. I think it's quite dramatically beautiful, but Now, this building, I don't know where it is, but it has won a prize. I find it peculiarly ugly. So, you know, there's a greater variation because we do not have an inherited template for building artifactual things, artifactual materials, as we do for biological materials. And this one, which I find great, I think he's the greatest architect of our time, Frank Gehry, has also been described as the worst architect in our time, which of course tells you that some people don't find this beautiful. This is a museum in Bilbao, but let us consider the fact that more people have visited Bilbao since the creation of this than had ever visited before, and more people go for the building than for what's inside. So I finish by saying that it all centers around this part of the brain, the medial-orbitofrontal cortex, the pleasure and reward center, and also, as it happens, the center of the brain in which activity correlates with the experience of beauty regardless of its source, and therefore gives you pleasure and reward and happiness, and that's why beauty matters. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Yael, for having me here and to contribute to this very important, I think, and interesting discussion. My name is Tateo Nakajima. I'm a fellow of Arup. I have the pleasure and honor of working almost exclusively on arts, culture, and entertainment projects. As Yael mentioned, I bring forward a history that started with a career as a musician, as a conductor. And over the last 20 years, I've had the pleasure of working with some of the greatest architects, I think, around, which has been an education and exploration and sometimes quite interesting discussions and struggles. I have the pleasure of leading a team at Arup that focuses on arts, culture, and entertainment with me. We are planners, designers, arts professionals, musicians, architects, and really try to bring forward, I think, the ideals that Ove Arup himself put in place around holistic architecture and holistic planning and design in this field. I get asked actually quite often, am I a scientist, an engineer, or an artist? And I tend to not like to answer direct questions, so I say, why do I have to choose? And in actual fact, I think this is a very interesting and pivotal question for acoustics in general, as a place, as a science that started barely 100 or some odd years ago with the measurement of phenomena and trying to understand what's happening, through a period of generating credibility, I think, by the repeatability of that phenomenon and being able to plan for it, to a time, I think, where we are, which is very, very interesting, around thinking about why we want to do things and the intentionality around it. And we in our practice actually talk about intention and how we feel quite a lot, which is somewhat, I think, something that many people would not expect of a team at Arup. Of course, this looks quite familiar, I think, to some. This is what acousticians are supposed to be doing. We think about reverberation time, we think about coverage, we use models, we do all that. We are very proud of the tools that we have, and we're very proud of the way that we are able to leverage technology to communicate better, to be more robust, reliant, and all of that. But as we get towards the subject of what we're talking about today, we have been discussing more and more how we talk about beauty and sound and character and identity in what we do. So this is from a project that we did recently in discussing with our clients, but also with the architect, what sort of sound we wanted. And we have been doing a lot of work in looking at how we talk about sound. How do we actually express to people who aren't technically educated? How do we actually create a sense of connection with people, with musicians around sound, and the sense that they want it to be beautiful, they want it to be meaningful, they want it to be memorable, and yet we don't want to create two environments ever that are the same. so that the sound of one place, one experience as a context is not the sound of another. And if you think about it, our feeling is that a hall or a place in Shanghai should not sound the same as one in London or one in Sao Paulo, that each should have something from which we can draw to create an environment for which musicians can use to express. So this was a place in China, and ultimately we found inspiration in communication through an artist's work, Chinese artist's work, to actually express something of the intensity of colors, the nature of the colors, the softness of them, and yet the depth of that color that for us started to talk about an elegance and a richness, but also a sense of float that allows a sense of mystery, magic, storytelling, allegory, and that there should be a brilliance and a detail to that color, but actually something that's soft enough that the brilliance comes out. And it's our job, of course, to then apply all the tools we have to create an environment where when an orchestra plays or a musician plays, you can actually feel that. You may not think about it, but you can feel that. And that actually, if you play the same musician in a different hall, you get a different result. It becomes a symbiotic relationship of the occupier and the context that creates a specific beauty. We're working on a project in Munich where we have the honor of being the acousticians for the new concert hall in Munich, working with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, which I think is one of the best orchestras in the world. And we were asked, what sort of sound do you think we should have? And this is a very interesting question because most acousticians would want to say something about reverberation time and loudness. And these are terms that we think about, but our answer went through the same sort of work that many architects would go and think about context, about where these people came from, and trying to create a sense of expression of beauty in sound. And actually beauty was a word that we have used here that actually speaks to where they are. Munich is different than Berlin. It is a context of people who love to spend their time outside. They consider themselves the northernmost city of Italy, and there is a delight to spend time outdoors. So if we want to create a space for music that feels like it belongs in Munich and not in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or in Berlin, then it should have something of that spaciousness, of that color, of that light. And at the same time, if we look at some of the buildings that represent periods of history in Munich, there is something about richness to texture, things you touch, certain highlights that we felt that we wanted to capture in the sound as well, that it's not all one big mass of neon color in sound, but rather something that had a stability to it, a sense of timelessness, but that there were things that came out in a depth of color. This is how we're talking about beauty and sound today, and this is we see as our mandate to deliver. And this may all feel a little bit fantastical, but we have had the pleasure of actually bringing forward this sort of thinking for many, many years now. This is a hall that we've done in Wrocław in Poland, where we were very interested in a sound that felt, quite frankly, like it had always been there. This is a city where the population before and after the Second World War was completely changed out. And when they repopulated the city after the Second World War, the city's cultural leaders decided to focus very much on what had happened in Baroque times, in medieval times, that there was music making, there was community gathering in that place for that time. And there was a sense, therefore, that I felt that you really had to create a place. The sound could not be a new sound. It had to be a sound that had this sense of depth, sense of stability, sense of timelessness that actually also overlaid with a fresh, contemporary market city mentality. And what has been wonderful to actually watch is how many people there talk about it being something that, if you'll forgive the pun, resonates with who they are. The musicians from around the world will actually go there to travel, not because it meets some neutral ideal of beauty or of sound, but actually that it's something that is beautiful but specific, beautiful but localized, contextualized, and that it is a place where that sound, you can only go there to create that sort of musical experience for those people, and the people who are there think that is something that has meaning and is memorable. Another project, which is one that has great meaning for me, is a work that we did with Wolf Briggs and Kolb Himmelblau, where somehow we managed to create the most integrated piece of architecture and sound, nature of sound that I've managed in my career to date. This is a project in Denmark. There is an obvious discussion about water in what you see. This is next to the water. There is the obvious discussion about the light and clarity of a northern city in the way that those spaces work, but there's a playfulness. And there's also a sense of creating something that has special, so that the people who are very comfortable in their life would come and experience something unusual, something memorable, something that actually is a change. And we wanted to do something in music that was the same. My goal here was to create a space that was so intense, so memorable, that it would shake this comfortable out of people and become something that was so immersive that it would become almost drug-like. And the sound here is very reverberant, it's fairly loud, it's very immersive, and it actually has a huge amount of colors. And in my mind, I always remember a film called Speed Racer, which probably nobody ever saw, but anyway, one that has a lot of neon lights and exactly the opposite of Wrocław, where actually it's very intense, fast-moving, and feels like you can touch the sound, it moving so quickly. So Yael asked me to reflect on the nature of beauty and that conversation. And we had a discussion in the team a little bit. And we find that it's very interesting that in looking back on the work with the architects we have had the pleasure of collaborating with, this word comes up very often, that somehow in explaining what you want to do, you have to justify it. I think we see it somewhat differently. I think there's a question of justification. There's a question of explanation. Right? There's a different emotional feeling to that. There's a difference of storytelling, and some of the great architects we've worked with actually don't justify, they tell stories. They tell stories to connect with the clients and with the communities about what they intend to do. And I think the word that actually has a lot of meaning for me in particular in my profession is actually magic. We used to be called the dark arts, and I suppose to a degree I don't mind that, because it keeps me away from justification. So effectively, I think we have to be able to have the rigor to be able to justify and explain, the storytelling abilities to be able to create comfort and have people come along with us. But there is a degree of that magic making that I think sometimes the profession as a whole, and I'm taking a broad profession, possibly doesn't have the intent, courage, whatever word we might use, to actually be able to go beyond justification and explanation to something else. And it is possible that that it's about something about this, that there is a responsibility, an awesome responsibility that comes from creating something that has a permanence. And in reflecting on that, I have to say that we have the interesting, if somewhat odd, situation of being the creators of the possibility of an experience. And the fact that it is something that has an ephemerality to it, but is equally permanent. And I have to recognize that architecture has that sense of it has to be something that's permanent, that is not just a new experience, it's not something that has the freshness of the ephemerality, that you have to be able to live with it, and the community has to be able to work around it. So I think we have to recognize that it is an awesomely responsible and difficult challenge. But I do think at the end, it has come down to also what we want to achieve. What we've been hearing really has to do with that there is a need to recognize that beauty is something that is important to us as human beings. We talk a lot about the fact that we create with our design and creative partners and our clients, we create spaces that allow us to be communities. We talk a lot at Europe about the fact that people live in cities, and cities are very important, and that's undeniably true. But a city without places where we experience things together actually is a place where a lot of people live. And if we're creating communities, our buildings, our environment is shaping who we are and what we say about who we are. And somewhere in that, I think, has to be beauty, and somewhere in that has to be that conviction that we want to make this a better world. Thank you.
Thank you for the patience, and I wonder if you have burning questions. If not, I have some. I'm sure maybe you have something you want to add?
No, I'm very puzzled, and it's very interesting news to me that you can actually construct a building to give you a different sound from the same instrument. Is that the implication?
No, that's actually the premise.
Yeah. So if I give you a Stradivarius violin, you can bring out potential in different ways in different buildings.
So the sound you hear is a relationship between the sound that's created and the space it's in. Right? So effectively, sound emanates from the instrument, and you're not only hearing direct sound, but sound that reflects, is modified, is adapted by the room you're in. So effectively, it's a symbiotic relationship. So the same ensemble playing the same work, and I actually have had the privilege, and it's very interesting to travel with the same group of artists from hall to hall. Because that's one of the few things that one of the few ways that you can sensorially and perceptually experience that difference. The performance, the orchestra will sound different, but more interestingly, the musicians will play differently, because musicians are, especially on tour, when they move, they are always reacting to what they hear. So they play in a small room, they practice, they go into a big stage. What you'll find is that they're playing subconsciously changes, not even consciously, subconsciously changes. Perhaps also neurologically or physically, their sense of space changes because they feel like they have to play louder because it's a big room, or they feel like because the sound moves differently, you have to play slower, or your heartbeat is different, and so your senses is different.
But if I were to give you a commission, I've got a very, very precious violin, and I love hearing it, and I would say to you, I want to hear it sound differently in two different churches, whatever it is. What is the metric that you use to, this is what I have not understood that.
So the metrics that have evolved in acoustics over the last 100 years, we use all of them, basically, most of them. From the way that the sound decays. Reverberation time is about how the sound decays, and you look at it different slices of time. As you will appreciate, the brain can actually amalgamate the multitude of information that comes to us, and we interpret it in our minds. So that's one part of it. How we perceive it spherically and laterally is another part of it. And then we have metrics for strength and so on, and effectively we can analyze different facets, if you like, different facets of the glass by using different metrics. The problem that I often talk about is those metrics are extremely important. Those are measurable tools that we use, but actually it's a little bit like finding the secrets of the Bach fugue by analyzing the fugues. You understand how what you're comparing, but you can't recreate it that way. So the creation process then can't be, I want a reverberation time of 2 seconds and this and that. It actually has to be, I think, what sort of sound do we want? And understand that actually the choices we make cannot generally mean you can't do certain things, but equally has to come from an understanding that different geometry, different volumes, shapes, materials change what we hear. And if I'm really naughty, I'll say color changes what we think we hear.
and texture changes that, which means that actually my work and that of architecture is pretty much inseparable.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Any question here amongst you?
Are you a musician, by the way?
Yes, I was a conductor and a violinist.
I have a few questions,
Yeah.
if I may. What I was going to say was a very generalized question. What do you think about, without ugly, if you want to use that expression, could there ever be beautiful? Would we appreciate what beauty is if we didn't have ugly? So that's one. Another question is, when we're in our search for beauty, assuming we are, and we believe that we have attained that search, it's almost a utopian ideal to try and achieve it. Once we've reached that goal, or we believe we've reached that goal, can we tire of that? Can you tire of beauty, is the question. And then are we en route? Similarly, if we could ever attain utopia, once we've achieved it, it no longer exists. We're searching for a new utopia. So that's the second question. Last question is, could it be in your research, and your examination of the brains of various individuals' test cases, that those test cases are already corrupt because they come from maybe different places, they may be educated differently, and is there a premise that beauty, or the understanding of the way the neurons fire in the frontal cortex, is inherent in our DNA, and it's simply passed down from generation to generation, and then once we are growing up as children, it then becomes modified to our own appreciation. So that's it.
I take it by you're looking at me, these are directed to me. Well, you asked three questions. May I just start by telling you a joke? Because there was a guy who was, his eyesight was fading, so he wanted to play golf very much. So he collared another old man and said, can you see? So yes, I can. Will you please play golf with me? Yeah, absolutely. So he hits the ball and said, oh, that was a good shot. Did you see where it went? He said, yes, absolutely. Where was it? I can't remember. So it has been three questions. Let me try to remember them.
Maybe repeat the first question.
No. Give me a chance. Give me a chance to remember. I'll ask the last question because my short-term memory stretches back all 50 picoseconds. Now, the thing is that, see, I was thinking about this 2 or 3 days ago because I have been listening to Beethoven's Missa Solemnis for years, and I can't begin to tell you how much pleasure it gave me over the past. This is after 40 years of listening to it, and how moved I was to tears by the Benedictus and the Passus. It was just wonderful. So that answers your question. Now, one of the reasons why I went, and this is partly an answer to your second question, or maybe the third one, I can't remember. One of the reasons I went into neuroesthetics really is a letter I got from a young Japanese guy whom I've never met, who wrote to me saying, Professor, I know nothing about the Christian culture, I know nothing about the Virgin Mother, I know nothing about Christ, but I went to the St. Peter's Basilica and saw Michelangelo's Requiem in marble and came out in tears. Can you explain that to me? That was a man who got nervous. So that partially answer your second question. But let me extend that about you. Basically, you're asking me to what extent our perception of beauty is dependent upon culture and learning and upbringing. Right. Well, babies, 6 weeks old, tend to orient preferentially toward beautiful faces. They orient towards faces at several hours after birth. And on the whole, I think that you have to look at it the other way around. And I'm coming back to your third question, so I remember them all, which is ugliness. It's very unlikely that anyone in any culture is going to find someone with one eye here and one eye here beautiful. It's not going to happen. And Francis Bacon, the English painter, when he said, "I want to give a visual shock," what did he do? He mutilated faces and bodies, but never objects. If you look at his paintings, the objects are not mutilated, but the face and bodies are mutilated. So I think that the experience of beauty is, in a biological beauty, faces and bodies, is really resistant, very resistant to changes. Now, I've done experiments in which I have subjected people daily to deformed faces, and the activity in the brain signaling that there is something abnormal about it never goes away. But with deformed objects, it does disappear. That answers your second question. So the third one is a question of ugliness. There's a tendency to regard ugliness as the other end of beauty. But ugliness is a different category. It is beautiful and not beautiful, and ugly and not ugly. So ugliness tends to engage a different part of the brain, which is the amygdala. The same part of the brain which is engaged when there's fear and terror and avoidance. So I think that I'm not knowledgeable enough to be able to be very, very doctrinaire about it, but I think that it's a mistake to regard something which is not beautiful as ugly. Two are different categories. I remember them all, see?
Can I contribute? Two perhaps random thoughts. One is that there's something odd in what I do, because everybody has a different opinion about what they hear in a concert hall. And yet consensus builds as to whether it's a great acoustic or not. Mm-hmm. Most people that go and listen to rooms that we've designed don't know what they're listening to. They may not even describe it regarding sound. They'll say, "I was very moved by the actor's performance," but actually, if you couldn't hear, it wouldn't have happened. So they might be actually looking at something else, and of course it's irrelevant, something else, but it is not the whole picture. So I find there's something quite interesting in your question about the sampling, because I do think, I agree that my experience would correlate with what you're saying, that there are things that across cultures are considered beautiful, and yet, of course, my basic premise is that we as designers can also try to actually appreciate the differences of that cultural programming. So this is quite interesting. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, is that as much as we do talk about beauty, we find it almost an quickly and unhelpfully vague term in our work, because when we're trying to describe the character, the characteristics, the personality of the spaces we're trying to create, beautiful is actually not very differentiated, right? So you can't say, actually, we want an ugly sound. Doesn't make any sense, because actually, in of itself, they are clearly not polar opposites, because you can have an ugly sound that's created in a context where otherwise it's beautiful. So there is a scale issue. And more interestingly, I think that actually we have a tendency to need to talk about things to actually define what beauty is in this context. And therefore, again, I don't think that it's about ugly. I think the opposite of beauty is probably the anodyne. The thing that has no personality, no intent, is just, yeah.
Well, look, beauty can be very precisely defined neurobiologically, extremely precisely defined. Mm. This is the definition of it. You see something, if you tell me it's beautiful, and I check to see if there's activity in your medial orbital frontal cortex, then it is beautiful. But if you tell me it's beautiful and I find no activity, then you're lying. It's as simple as that.
I must add something that out of our conversation. Yeah, I think it's really good. But I remember in our earlier conversations that I was so pleased to hear that the site in the brain where we experience ugliness is the same site in the brain where we experience disgust and vomiting and all of that. Yes. I was so pleased. And then beauty is where we experience the romantic love and desire and all of that. So it's like in two different parts of the brain, because when we grew up as architects through education, I heard it so many times by our teachers, different. I think even Wolf Brix, who actually has a fantastic eye and very great talent. There was a period that it was so common to hear, yes, it's ugly at the beginning, and then it becomes beautiful, or that the kind of shifting of ugly to beauty was like almost a cultural kind of trust belief. And I think that that's why I was so pleased. It's not possible. It's not. And in the conference, I was very pleased that if it was Graham Harman who came with his the literal is the opposite. And so I was very pleased.
I want to ask you. Oh.
Yes.
So, do you see beauty as something that is subjective? It's specific to me and to where I'm now, and to time-bound or culture-bound, or is it something more generic? That is, when beauty for me is for everybody. And I think, if I might close this question, is distill it to, and I'm an engineer, so can you train a computer model to tell you this is beautiful or this is not beautiful?
Well, I mean, the computer model is dependent upon the human input. So at the moment, I'm not able to answer your question. If you had a computer which is totally independent of human input, such thing could be designed and that question can be answered. I cannot answer it now because I've talked to various people about that, and they all say, well, it's all human input. Right? On the first part of your question, what I'm disputing with biological beauty. Well, what do I mean by biological beauty? The beauty of human faces, beauty of human bodies, the beauty of landscapes, the beauty of animals, the beauty of the kinetic beauty. I think on that there is very little subjectivity. I think there's quite a lot of objectivity. On other things, I think that there is a significant amount of variability. I mean, we've seen it in buildings, in cars. Buildings perhaps a bit less because, as I was quoting Michelangelo, it depends upon certain mathematical, a respect for certain mathematical principles. But with cars and with planes and with forks and knives and chopsticks and all that, there can be quite a lot of variation.
But I think, in a minute, I think that I still remember while teaching, and there's the moment of the portfolio reviews, and every School of Architecture, everybody very familiar, the A, Bartlett, and others. And there's a moment where, sometimes around the table are sitting the tutors, who really often hate each other and don't respect each other, and each one is fighting for completely different agendas and all of that. And then there's coming a portfolio and a project that is really so strongly beautiful that all of a sudden everybody agrees that this guy has a fantastic talent. And that, so I think when things are so, we argue about it and we don't agree. When something is really strongly very beautiful, even in architecture, not just biological, beauty is something that kind of we agree more than expected.
I think it's also interesting that you can agree that something is beautiful without necessarily liking it. I find that in that sort of context, I find sometimes that you can agree that it's significant and has beauty, but you can separate what you would want to do yourself or even possibly a place you want to live in. It's a complete separate thing. And I think that's quite interesting that there is a process there that you recognize there's almost a reaction to it. But it doesn't have to align with intellectual process, which for me suggests indeed that there is something that is quite universal about it.
There's a question coming from there, from Eva.
Yael, thank you so much for bringing this conversation at the AA. I think the conversation around ideas of beauty and aesthetics is an important one, a very important one. And yet, when I saw your video a few months ago when you gave me a privileged access, and what I loved about it was the multiplicity of voices that you brought together with very different ideological positions in relationship of what that is and means. Because in fact, there are no answers to some of the questions that are being posed to this fabulous forum. And yet, I can't avoid but remember some of the things that throughout the history of architecture we have been discussing. It was 1952 when RIVA actually asked all its members a very simple question, not devoid of ideological and aesthetic power, that said, do systems of proportion make good architecture easier and bad architecture more difficult? Yeah? That has to do with issues of mathematics, it has to do with issues of proportion, and it has to do with particular ideas or understandings of what beauty might be in relationship to given structures of static mathematical understanding. And I think that was a very interesting question following Second World War, where everyone was trying to somehow externalize the principles by which we actually existed, try to produce forms of belief, if you want, outside of the subject. The idea of subjectivity for the last 50 years or so was one that was relegated. We constantly try to engage with architectural discourses, very much based with ideas of the rational, of the objective, of the Cartesian, if you want. And anything that had to do with the phenomenological was always, if you want, approach from a space of suspicion. Cognitive science has allowed us to enter that from a kind of scientific point of view and allow us to actually start thinking about the subjective from a different aspect. But so, aesthetics in this school over the last year and a half has been discussed in terms not only, if you want, our motto is design with beauty, built in truth. Two words that have been used today, and yet I think that what beauty is and what truth is today is changing. I don't believe that beauty is something that exists out there as a kind of platonic space that we have access to through either a mathematical model or a neurological model, but in fact it is a politically constructed and built space that does refer to particular cultures, bodies, and if you want, the way in which we relate ourselves to each other and to our bodies. Now, I have a very simple question after all these conversations. That has to do with, I do believe we have a responsibility as a generation to produce an aesthetic project, an aesthetic regime, that is able to respond to some of the most important and relevant questions. If the modern movement managed to succeed as a movement, is because it had, maybe not directly by a project of causation, an aesthetic project associated to an aspirational project. The modern movement, we could say, that was aspiring to be the best for the most for the least, and when some nice characters came with 5 points about how to actually get into the modern project, we all somehow almost subscribed ourselves and believed it. It was an aesthetic project that had nothing to do with a political one. Yet right now we are all trying to answer issues of climate, issues of sustainability, generosity, equity, and so on, and yet we don't have an aesthetic project attached to it. We don't have a sense of beauty attached to it. In fact, beauty is something that someone like Donald Trump will talk about with a lot of authority, like a baby that actually probably will look immediately to someone who actually he will consider to be beautiful, including a particular architectural aesthetic, an architectural regime, a neoclassical one that he tries to impose to all the government buildings. So within that in mind, I would like maybe to talk to something that is more present than urgent, and I don't know how to respond, because if we are to actually ask ourselves, how does a community that, like the architectural community in this lecture hall at DAA, that has constantly tried to experiment with questions of aesthetics, understanding that radical aesthetics are the ones that liberate us from the inherited structures of power and beauty to try to produce new ones, uncanny ones in which we can be more free, more equal, more us. What do we answer to Trump? So I would like the panel maybe to somehow think about what does one answer to Trump when he's asking that all those buildings take into an, if you want, Renaissance, symmetrical, beautiful architecture.
It's a very large question.
Samir, you can start. We can go in order. Doesn't matter.
I think you've dragged in politics into this. Of course, it has to be dragged in at some point. But I think you're talking.
Can you get closer to the microphone?
Sorry, I said you've dragged politics into this, and I think, of course, politics is important consideration. But there are certain things which we have to understand. First of all, we're talking about beauty, not about art, right? The two are different. I mean, Picasso's Guernica is a very disturbing piece of work and wonderful piece of work, but it is not exactly very beautiful, I don't think. But it's really, what?
I would disagree.
I disagree entirely.
Good. But there's, you see, your disagreeing with me doesn't matter. My disagreeing with you does not matter. The fact is that there are two people here, you and me, allow me to finish, you and me, who have got different opinions about that, which means that there's no universal appreciation of that as a beautiful work. But I would agree with you if what you're saying to me is an important piece of work, immensely so. I am talking really about biological beauty. I don't think there's that much of a subjectivity in biological beauty. There's probably a lot in artifactual beauty. Of course there is.
Can mathematics be subjective?
Mathematics is an objective thing, and I think that I consider mathematics to be in the biological category, mathematical beauty, because you see, mathematics is one of the most wonderful ways of showing the importance of biological beauty, because mathematicians as long as they understand the language of mathematics, be they Japanese or Chinese or Indian or English, will understand, will appreciate the beauty of mathematics, because Immanuel Kant asked, what does the beauty of mathematics reside in? And his answer was in the fact that it makes sense. He did not ask the next question, who does it and what does it make sense to? Well, I'm going to give you the answer. It makes sense to the logical system of the brain. And the logical system of the brain in the mathematician in India and in Afghanistan and in England are the same. That's why they are agreed on it, and that's why it is objective.
But could we agree that we are talking about different ideas of beauty? And I don't think it is helpful nor healthy to conflate.
To complain, I'm not complaining. I'm saying I am saying that we're talking about different ideas. That's what I'm saying to you. However, allow me. Now you've had your say. Now I must have my say. You had a long question, so I'm going to give you a very brief answer. I think that we do have different ideas of beauty, but I'm talking about biological beauty as being non-subjective and artificial beauty as being subjective. But I'm adding to it that I can determine what you find beautiful and what I find beautiful by simply looking at two things. One is whether you declare it beautiful, and two is whether there's activity in your medial prefrontal cortex. It's as simple as that.
We understood that, but you didn't answer the question. But that's fine. It's a difficult.
I haven't answered the question. No. You have asked you gave a very lengthy discourse before bringing in the politics into question. But what I'm saying to you is that if you want to go to the primitives of beauty, there are inherited templates, such as the proportions of a face that are critical to respect if you want to find a face beautiful, such as symmetries which are critical. Well, you're shaking your head, but show me a painting, show me somebody who's got one eye here and one eye here and one nose here who's beautiful. Show me that and you'll convince me.
That's a political statement.
Correct.
Why?
Because first of all, it's okay to use the word objective to give authority to art, that it has been somehow, in some intuitive way, my client has somehow intuited a mathematical structure that informed his work.
I'm not giving it to art. I talked about biological beauty. That's a different thing.
Yeah, I think if I'm...
No. I distinguish between art and...
The way people used to use God. I think it's very unsatisfactory. There's something missing.
What is unsatisfactory about it? First of all, do we agree that I said I'm not talking about art, I'm talking about beauty, the two should be distinguished? I did say that.
You did say that, but that's not what you've actually been saying, but you did actually say that sentence.
Oh, wasn't it? I thought I emphasized the beauty of bodies, the beauty of faces.
Art and talking about it judgmentally, in putting it in hierarchical structures.
I give in to you. If that's what you want to think, read into it, fine.
I think
it's a satisfactory answer. And I might say it's a very subjective.
I think what you would say to Trump is exactly the same that we should be saying regarding the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. 45 rules and regulations or suggestions, if you like, all in a very well-intended spirit to make domestic residential buildings and other buildings more beautiful, but that beauty emanates from the eyes of and minds of the members of the committee that put it together. I don't know if
I mean, the trouble
is the same way that Trump is being advised by a similar type of commission who are proposing that the only way to design federal buildings is in the classical style. Whether POTUS, I think he likes that style, so that's fine for him, but it's suggesting that you can't design federal buildings that are beautiful, well proportioned, in a modern style, whichever style that happens to be. It might be a style at all. And the same residential buildings.
Well, I say, but I can't. Well, I didn't say it was political. It was political. I can't really engage in this. I'll tell you why. Because I don't know what Trump's ideas of beauty are, and nobody has told me what Trump's ideas of beauty are. But once you expose them to me, what is beauty? What his idea of beauty in buildings may be? What is his wife is certainly quite attractive and beautiful. I can't engage in this discussion?
I think it's a difficult question, but I have another one for you, which is slightly more esoteric.
Oh no!
It's about Da Vinci and the studies of the human body and proportions of the human body, and really, I mean, is it just by chance? It is just by chance or divine intervention that our planet happens to be a certain distance from the sun, and we have a moon that is a certain distance away from our planet, that provides us with force of gravity. And for the engineers that are even gone now, I've been reading an interesting book from college days called Structure, the Essence of Architecture, which explains this very well. And if we happen to be a bit further away from the sun, and less gravity, and the moon was a bit further away, we might be as tall as, double the height we are now, and our proportions would change dramatically. Whereas if we were closer to the sun and our moon was closer, the force of gravity, which is dictating our proportions, and our buildings to some extent, would make us squat. But maybe if we didn't know any better, those proportions would be beautiful.
Indeed, why not? I mean, also, we have to think that we're going to mate, so we have to find somebody mating with giving us pleasure, stimulating the pleasure center of the brain. Indeed, if we had different gravitational characteristics, we might change. But the question is, we don't. I mean, we are stuck in this world, and this is what we're living with.
We're still owing some answers to Eva here.
Have a little anecdote that might illuminate what I was with some friends. I'm not an architect. He was an architect, and his wife was an architect, and we were all discussing a building, and most of us agreed that this building was ugly. And then my friend who's an architect said, no, it's a really beautiful building. And then his wife said, is that a building you've been taught should be beautiful? And I thought that was really interesting, because I think what we value and the context where we learn things might influence what we regard as beautiful. And maybe the architectural profession does have a very, has a community of thought that is actually quite monotone sometimes, in that a lot of people seem to come from the same value system. And I think probably one that I agree with, but it did strike me that value system was quite uniform throughout the profession of the ones I've met.
Was this a question or a statement?
It was an anecdote. He said it was an anecdote.
Okay, that's good.
It was interesting because value systems were coming in to the judgment of what was beautiful and what aesthetic style is, appropriate for something.
But I think in architecture, as we keep kind of saying that, each time has its own beauty, and beauty is not the Renaissance beauty. It's not the one beauty. It's not the one kind of set of proportion. It's not the one thing. It's the variety of it. And I think, it's all open to, to the now and to the truth now. And, I think certain things still feels beautiful to us, even though it was, they were designed and done 500 years ago, 200 years ago. But of course, we are interested, the novelty and the newness and the fresh thought and the ideas of the now. And so I know it won't answer your question, because you're coming from, a much more kind of political agenda, and even taking the word aesthetics to kind of almost different territories. But I don't see the differences. I think that, what is, if a project is done and it's a project and it's to be built or not to be built, as in the portfolios we know when something is beautiful, but not discussing it, not talking about it, not, yes, maybe you're discussing it here in the last, year intensively, but it's not out there yet. So.
I'm not an architect, but I'll permit myself to comment on your question by adroitly avoiding the political aspect for a moment. I wonder at two parts of your question. One is whether or not there is necessarily an imperative that there is a generational aesthetic voice. I'm not sure, actually. I think sometimes these things are the result of forces, and sometimes they're a confluence, and sometimes, yes, some group of people sat down in a cafe and wrote a manifesto, and it turned out to be pretty good, right? I think that's fine. But I think that's one thing. I think that the reality is that there is a wide range of work being done around the world in any given community, some of it good, some of it biscuit architecture, some of it less good, and we all have different opinions about it. But let's say for a moment that we generally have a sense of what's really good, what's acceptable, and what's maybe not so good. Actually, the commonality actually is pretty good. The effort to try to make that better, I don't think, because it comes out of Trump's mouth or whoever's mouth, should be denigrated. That effort, I think, has a value to it. But I also wonder sometimes whether we are consistently considering what are the causes of some of that? Because let's face it, some of the work that is completely cost-driven, completely unresponsive, and looks like that hospital photo we saw, was signed off by somebody of your profession. And number one, somebody might be proud of it, so let's be careful of that. But the other part of it is it actually is a profession that actually I think is deliciously diverse, but also one that is sometimes a bit hypocritical of itself, if I may say, just as mine is. That is to say, we all want to work, we need to live, we have clients, we need to get paid. That's just the reality of it. And I think that we have to be conscious that as a building industry, I don't know that we are consistently doing things the way our better selves would like. And then when somebody wants to create order, I think it's a human, so it's probably inherently somewhat flawed. But I'm not sure that you should fight it just because somebody wanted to make the effort, actually, or attribute to make it necessarily bad just because of its source. So that would be my slight comment on that. I have my own opinions about anybody's desire to create order and the particular order they want to create, but I think the dialogue is more important, and then I think we all have to try to live up to what we say we want to do.
As an architect, I'm thinking on my feet here, so bear with me, but is there an element of what we get paid for?
So we get paid for form, following function. We get paid to be on time. We get paid to be sustainable. But no one ever says, we'll pay you more if it triggers the beauty part of my brain, and it also triggers the beauty sense within a percentage of people that come and visit or see it. I think if you're very successful, that's fine, and that's what you do get paid for, that magic. But until you prove yourself and you become respected enough to charge that as a quantifiable kind of skill and service, and until we perhaps have a conversation about one of our responsibilities being that beauty and that being quantifiable as an element of the brain that's triggered, is it that the conversation isn't there to allow us to be paid, and therefore there may be many, the conversation needs to continue and grow so that it's something that we're truly rewarded for and we get time to explore and build for.
Are you sure about what you're saying? I mean, we pay millions upon millions of pounds to have beautiful houses, to have beautiful buildings, to buy beautiful paintings, to beautify ourselves, to be attractive. I mean, are you sure that you're right in saying, look, Maria Callas, the greatest singer of all time. I mean, she was paid for what? Not for being a woman, not for having slimmed down. She was paid a lot because she had a beautiful voice. And she said at the end, she said, I know my voice is gone, everybody else knows my voice is gone. And she acknowledged that. In the end, she was not being paid. So I'm not sure I agree with your premise.
I totally agree, because Lila reflected. Because Lila reflected on a problem in our profession, and because we don't talk about what we might be excel at, we don't. Beauty is not discussed. What is being discussed all the time is the form function, or it's going to very basic, and that's what people think what architects are doing, and that's the way it goes, and it's very sad. And I know from the profession, that she reflected on something which is very true.
When you have a client, he wants it to be beautiful.
Yes.
And this is the first thing.
Yes.
After that, need to be all the rest, but it must be beautiful.
Yes.
I think I do think that there is a subject here about getting clients to actually expect more for you. I also think that I have to reflect on a friend of mine who is, I think, a great architect. And one of his talents is actually to really digest and do everything the client wanted, but in a way that the client doesn't expect. And that actually is both a talent and a skill. So I have to say that working with Wolf Briggs, for example, the ability that he has to tell stories and get people to want what he wants to do is one of his great skills, right? And we are all in a situation where, yes, there are some basics, and if you allow the conversation to be only about that, then that's what it becomes. And I do think this is one of those things where the profession has a tendency to have people who will say, I'll do this for you, I'll hit all your boxes, and it'll be cheaper. Instead of the profession as a whole saying, there is more to life than that. And I think that's a reality of our human existence, but at the same time, I think a question for a profession where, if we're not careful, as much in engineering as in architecture, we will get automated, we will get reduced, and what's left as value is your point of view, your ability to create something beautiful, etc., because that actually is the one thing that cannot be automated.
May I say, we're making the mistake of, I'm in agreement with you, we're making the mistake of treating beauty as if it was a sole thing. Of course, there are other features. I mean, an architect, when he's asked to design, or she's asked to design a building, she's got to take into account hundreds of other things. It's not just the beauty. Sure. But beauty is a very important factor. I mean, look at this. I want to provoke people here. This ghastly building, the Centre Pompidou in Paris. Ghastly. But forget about what I think about it. The fact is, there's another aspect. Practically, it is imploding all the time because it was badly conceived, structurally badly conceived. So they have to shut it down every few years. What?
It's really time for drinks.
Yeah, and as a fellow Arab, I feel like I have to defend the building structurally.
I'm trying to be provocative.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? Yeah, for Semi, in terms of natural beauty, can you say something about the subversive use of beauty? Things like subversive use of beauty, histories like or stories like Dorian Gray.
Dorian Gray?
Yes, and how beauty can obfuscate intelligence.
How beauty can what?
Obfuscate intelligence, for example. How can it deceive us?
Well, beauty is subversive. Beauty does lead to desire, and beauty does lead people to pursue it in spite of various practical difficulties. Beauty in itself is a subversive thing, yes, sure.
So it's never a source of truth, then?
What?
Never a source of truth.
It's always a source of truth. It's always people are so enamored of beauty that they are prepared to trample upon reason and upon everything else to attain it. So it is absolutely the guide to truth, I think.
I'm sorry, but I think we have to stop it now. There is a catering and organized, and yes, Catherine is sitting in opposite me, and and the room will be closed by 10 o'clock, and there was a lot of effort done for that. So if there's any finishing lines, words.
Well, I'm thrilled and delighted to be able to give a slightly different point, a neurobiological point, to beauty. I know that there are many people who will resist this. I know that they would hate me for it, but in time, I think they will learn.